Picture a bowl of soup so plain and so cheap that most people today wouldn't look at it twice. And yet it kept coal miners standing upright through 16-hour shifts, kept farmhands swinging an axe in the freezing cold, and kept grandmothers who'd raised 9 children looking stronger at 60 than half the gym-goers you'll see this week. That soup is still sitting quietly in an old recipe box somewhere, completely forgotten, while people down the street spend real money every single month on powders and shakes that don't do half the job it did for free. Stick with me for the next few minutes, because by the time we reach soup number 7 on this list, you're going to understand exactly why our grandparents almost never got sick, almost never got weak, and almost never needed a single supplement to make it through a brutal winter. There's one soup near the end of this list that a doctor would have called medicine before he ever called it dinner, and I promise you, once you hear what it actually did for the body, you won't look at your own kitchen the same way again. And stay through to the very last one on the list too, because it's the pot that quietly ties every single other soup on here together. The one lesson our grandparents built their entire kitchen around without ever writing it down. Before we get into it, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, because this channel is built entirely around bringing back old food wisdom. The practical kind of knowledge that used to just get handed down at a kitchen table instead of sold to you in a bottle. And there's a brand new video like this one coming your way every single week. It's worth saying plainly, our grandparents never had a nutrition label to check, never counted a single gram of anything, and never once worried about hitting a daily protein target. They simply knew, from watching what kept a body upright through 60 hours of hard labor a week, exactly which pots belonged on the stove and which ones didn't. That kind of knowledge came the hard way, through cold winters, thin harvests, and a whole lot of trial and error, and it's exactly the kind of knowledge we're bringing back to life today. Now, let's get right into these 10 old-fashioned protein soups that kept our grandparents strong, capable, and genuinely healthy. Soup 1, Split Pea and Ham Bone Soup, the winter pot that never let a family go hungry. Long before anybody owned a refrigerator, dried split peas were doing quiet, heroic work in the back of every pantry. A single sack, bought cheap in the fall, could carry a family clean through to spring without spoiling, and that alone made it one of the most trusted foods a household could own. The real genius, though, was what happened when an old cook dropped a leftover ham bone into that pot of peas. Suddenly, a humble bowl of starch turned into a real, strengthening meal, thick with plant protein from the peas and rich, savory depth from every last scrap still clinging to that bone. Nothing in that kitchen ever went to waste. Sunday's ham became Tuesday's soup, and Tuesday's soup fed the whole family clear through to the end of the week. If you want to try it yourself, you don't even need to soak the peas first. Just rinse them, drop in your bone along with an onion, a carrot, and a little black pepper, and let a long, slow simmer do all the work. The peas break down completely on their own into that thick, spoon-coating body no other legume quite manages, though it's worth going easy on added salt since a cured ham bone already carries plenty on its own. It's proof that the cheapest bag in the whole grocery store once fed a family better than anything with a fancy label ever could. And here's the part most people miss entirely. A single cup of cooked split peas carries roughly the same protein as a small piece of chicken at a fraction of the cost, which is exactly why a working family could keep this pot going all winter long without ever feeling like they were going without. It's the kind of quiet, unglamorous math that never made it into a cookbook, but every farm wife of that era carried it around in her head without ever needing to write it down. Soup 2, Navy Bean and Salt Pork Soup, the pantry pot that stretched one small piece of meat across an entire week. Long before canned soup ever sat on a store shelf, this one was simmering quietly in farmhouses everywhere, built around a genuinely smart idea. Dried beans were about as cheap and dependable as protein ever got, and a single scrap of salt pork or a few strips of bacon turned a plain pot into something a hungry family actually looked forward to. The fat carried flavor into every spoonful, and a little of it went a remarkably long way, which was the entire quiet trick behind old homestead cooking. You didn't need a big cut of meat to make a meal feel substantial. You needed one flavorful piece sitting in a pot of something hearty enough to soak it all up. Navy beans cooked down soft and creamy, though great northern beans or pintos worked just as well, depending on what the pantry happened to hold that particular week. A smart move if you're making it today is to save your rendered fat and use it to soften onion and celery right at the start, building a deep, savory base without a single fancy ingredient. Give your dried beans a proper long soak and a full, gentle simmer, since a properly cooked bean sits far easier on the stomach than a rushed one. And rushing this particular step is the single most common reason people give up on bean soup before it ever gets the chance to win them over. Serve it with a warm heel of bread, and you've got the exact humble meal that carried hard-working families through the leanest stretches of an entire year. Some old cooks even kept the bean pot going for days on end, adding a splash of water and a few more beans each morning. So there was always something warm and filling waiting whenever a hungry field hand walked back through the door. Soup 3. Whole hen and rice soup. The Sunday pot built from a bird that had already given everything. When a laying hen finally stopped laying, she went straight into the pot rather than the trash, and that tough old bird needed hours of slow, patient simmering before she'd ever turn tender. That long simmer pulled everything valuable out of the bones and the meat and turned it into a rich, golden broth that fed the entire family without a single scrap wasted. The meat gave real, satisfying protein, and a good handful of rice, simmered right there in that same broth, stretched one modest bird into a meal big enough for a crowd. Old cooks always saved the picked clean carcass afterward and simmered it a second time the very next day because they understood something modern kitchens have mostly forgotten. The bones were the most valuable part of that whole bird. Simmering chicken bones low and slow draws out collagen and minerals that make a broth both deeply flavorful and genuinely nourishing. So skim the foam that rises early on, keep the heat gentle, and never rush it, because a hard, rolling boil will only cloud the broth and toughen up what little meat is left clinging to the bird. Reach for boneless, skinless everything if you like for a quick weeknight dinner, but know that your grandmother would have looked at you funny for tossing those bones straight in the garbage. A little dried thyme and a bay leaf dropped in during that first long simmer rounds the whole broth out beautifully, and the rice, cooked right there in that same pot rather than separately, soaks up every bit of that good chicken flavor instead of tasting like plain filler. Soup 4. Lentil and smoked sausage soup, the fast pot that fed working families in under an hour. Lentils are one of the very oldest foods human beings have ever eaten, and they earned their lasting place through sheer, dependable reliability. They need no soaking at all. They cook faster than any other dried legume, and they deliver a hearty, filling protein that genuinely sticks with you. For a busy household, that speed mattered enormously, since a full pot of lentils could go from pantry to table in well under an hour, which was practically fast food by the standards of the day. A little smoked sausage or a spoonful of drippings added real richness, and whatever the garden happened to offer, an onion, a carrot, a handful of greens, rounded the whole thing out. Here's a habit worth stealing directly from the old cooks. They nearly always finished the pot with a splash of vinegar or a squeeze of fresh lemon right at the very end, and that bright acid doesn't just wake up the flavor, it actually helps your body absorb the iron that lentils naturally carry, which is exactly why this soup was so valued for building up strength during a hard winter. Brown lentils hold their shape nicely, while red lentils melt down into a thick, comforting puree, and either one proves that a soup can be cheap, fast, and still keep a working body going strong. If you've only ever had a bland, watery lentil soup somewhere and written the whole dish off, the honest fix is almost never more cooking time. It's more seasoning, more acid, and a good hard pinch of salt stirred in near the very end. And once you try it that way, you'll wonder why anyone ever settled for the flat, forgettable version most people assume this soup has to be. Soup 5. Beef and barley soup, the ranch country pot that stuck to your ribs. Out in wide open cattle country, this soup fed hardworking people through brutal winters by joining two humble things into something genuinely mighty. A cheap, tough cut of beef that needed hours of patience to soften, and a generous scoop of pearl barley, one of the oldest grains our ancestors ever farmed. Simmered together low and slow, the tough meat turned fork tender while the barley swelled up thick and chewy, giving the whole pot real, satisfying body. The beef supplied lasting protein, and the barley added a slow, steady kind of energy that didn't leave anyone hungry again an hour later. The trick the old cooks understood in their bones was to brown that beef hard before adding a drop of water, because that dark, seared crust is exactly where the deep, rich flavor comes from. and skipping it leaves the whole pot tasting flat. Barley keeps right on drinking up liquid even after it's fully cooked, so if you're saving leftovers for the next day, plan on adding a good splash of extra broth. It's exactly the kind of forgotten meal that proves the cheapest cut in the whole case. Cooked with real patience, beats the priciest steak for keeping a body genuinely strong. Old ranch cooks would often let a big pot like this simmer gently all day on the back of the stove while everyone was out working the land, so that a hot, filling meal was simply waiting the moment the whole family finally came in from the cold. And there's real wisdom in that patience, because a soup like this one only gets better the longer it's allowed to sit and slowly come together. Let me pause here for just a moment. If any of these old recipes are stirring up a memory of a soup your own family used to make, drop the name of it down in the comments, because I genuinely love reading every single one. And if you're finding real value in what we're covering today, a like and a subscribe helps this channel keep these old ways alive for a lot more people to find. Now let's get right back into it, because the next few soups on this list are honestly some of the strongest of the entire 10, and that promise I made you earlier about a soup that a doctor would have called medicine is coming up sooner than you think. Soup 6, Oxtail Soup, the throwaway cut that made the richest bowl on the whole table. This one says everything about how our grandparents actually thought about food. Oxtail was once considered nothing but scrap, the plain tail of the animal that a butcher would practically give away for free. Yet those bony, gelatin-rich little pieces made one of the deepest, most nourishing soups a family could possibly sit down to. Long, slow, patient simmering breaks down all that tough connective tissue into a broth so rich it turns silky and almost sticky right on your lips. And that's collagen quietly doing its work. Exactly what made this overlooked cut so prized by people who understood real, honest cooking. The meat clinging to those small bones becomes meltingly tender, and the whole pot stretches a cheap, overlooked ingredient into something that genuinely feels luxurious. The only real tip here is patience, plain and simple. Brown the pieces well first, then let them barely simmer for a long, quiet afternoon until the meat falls clean off the bone, skimming the fat if you like a cleaner broth or leaving it in for richness, and adding your root vegetables near the end so they don't turn to mush. What most people carelessly throw in the trash today, our grandparents patiently turned into the finest pot on the whole stove. And there's a real reason to seek this one out today beyond nostalgia, since that same gelatin-rich broth is exactly what a lot of modern folks pay a premium for in fancy bone broth cartons, without ever realizing their own grandparents were quietly making a far richer version of it out of a cut of meat the butcher used to throw in for free. Soup 7, Beef Bone Broth. The ancient nourishing pot standing quietly behind almost every other soup on this list. Long before it ever became a trendy health drink sold by the cup in fancy shops, bone broth was simply how careful cooks squeezed the last bit of honest value out of an animal. Beef bones, especially the knuckle and marrow bones, were simmered gently for the better part of a whole day until they'd given up everything they had left to give, and what's left behind is a broth rich in collagen, gelatin, and good minerals. Exactly the kind of deep nourishment traditional cooks reached for whenever somebody needed real strengthening. There's a genuine reason a warm mug of good beef broth was handed to the sick, the elderly, and the rundown for generation after generation. It's gentle, it's warming, and it delivers real nourishment in the easiest form a weak body can take. The old secret to a truly great broth comes down to two simple things: patience and a small splash of vinegar added right into the water at the start, which quietly helps draw all those good minerals out of the bones. Roast the bones first for a deeper, richer color and flavor, then simmer them low and slow with an onion, a carrot, and a single bay leaf, skimming the top now and then and never once rushing the process. Our grandparents built entire nourishing meals out of exactly what most people now throw straight in the garbage. And this is the very pot that made that possible, which is exactly why I promised you earlier that this one deserved to be called medicine as much as dinner. A big batch, made once a week and kept in the icebox or the cool cellar, became the quiet foundation for half a dozen other meals, stirred into a pot of beans, ladled over rice, or simply sipped warm from a mug on a cold morning before the day's work even began. Soup 8, Chicken Liver and Vegetable Soup, the strengthening pot for the weak and the weary. This is the soup old-timers reached for whenever someone in the house genuinely needed building up. Organ meats like liver were truly treasured in traditional kitchens, and there's good sense behind that, since liver is one of the most concentrated foods on earth for iron and B vitamins, exactly what a run-down, tired body needs to regain its strength. When someone was slowly recovering from illness or a long, hard winter, a warm broth carrying tender little bits of liver and soft vegetables was considered deeply restoring. Our grandparents didn't have a laboratory to explain why, but they had generations of quietly watching what actually worked, and liver always earned its honored place. The key to enjoying it is a light and careful hand, since liver turns bitter and grainy the moment it's overcooked, so add it gently and briefly, letting it stay tender in a savory vegetable broth. Soaking the liver in a little milk beforehand mellows out any strong taste, an old trick that makes all the difference for anyone who thinks they don't care for it. One word of gentle caution: since liver is so rich in vitamin A and iron, it's genuinely a food to enjoy in reasonable amounts rather than every single day, and anyone who is pregnant should check with a doctor about liver specifically. Used wisely, though, it was one of the most quietly powerful, strengthening foods in the entire traditional kitchen. A grandmother who noticed a child looking pale or a husband looking worn thin after a hard season rarely reached for a tonic from the store. She reached for this pot instead, and more often than not, it worked exactly the way she expected it to, quietly and without any fuss, the same way it had worked for every generation of her own family before her. Soup 9, Black-Eyed Pea and Ham Soup. The southern pot built for good luck and real strength alike. Black-eyed peas have fed working families across the American South for generations, valued as much for their steady, dependable protein as for the tradition of serving them for good fortune on the first day of a brand new year. A good pot of them, simmered slowly with a ham hock or a leftover bone, turns dense, smoky, and remarkably filling. Exactly the kind of meal that fills a body up on very little money at all. The peas deliver a strong plant protein along with a good, healthy dose of fiber, which is a big part of why this soup satisfies so deeply and keeps you full for hours on end. Working families leaned hard on food like this because it stretched a tight budget further than almost anything else you could name. The real flavor secret in the old versions was always the seasoning: a little onion, garlic, maybe a pinch of cayenne, and that smoked ham bone, which together transform plain peas into something rich and genuinely craveable. A good preparation tip worth keeping in your back pocket is to mash a cup or two of the cooked peas and stir them right back into the pot for a thicker, creamier body without a drop of cream. Finish it with a splash of vinegar or hot sauce right at the table, exactly the way it's been done in southern kitchens for longer than anyone can properly remember. Serve it over a scoop of rice with a wedge of cornbread on the side, and you've got a meal that has quietly kept working families fed, strong, and hopeful for the year ahead for longer than most of us can trace back, tying together good luck and good nutrition in the very same simmering pot. Soup 10, Kidney bean and cabbage soup, the mighty pot that fed whole generations strong right through the toughest stretches of the year. We finish here with a soup that brings together absolutely everything this whole list has stood for. Take a bag of dried kidney beans, add in some humble cabbage, an onion, a carrot, maybe a smoke bone or a scrap of salt pork if the pantry happened to have one, and simmer it all slowly down into a rich, hearty, deeply satisfying meal. This was honest survival food across countless cultures the world over. Exactly the kind of mighty pot that fed hardworking families through the toughest of times and kept them strong enough to face down the next day's hard labor. The beans gave lasting plant protein and turned the whole broth rich and thick, while the cabbage added real body, quiet goodness, and more than enough fiber to keep everyone genuinely full for a good long while. This is the whole honest spirit of old-fashioned cooking captured in one single bowl, taking the least expensive ingredients a family could find and, with nothing but time and patient care, transforming them into something genuinely nourishing and truly good. Give your beans a proper soak and a full, gentle simmer so they sit easy on the stomach. Add your cabbage in the later stages so it doesn't turn to mush, and finish the whole pot with a splash of vinegar or a squeeze of fresh lemon to brighten everything up right at the very end. It's the perfect note to end on, because it proves clean and clear exactly what our grandparents always knew deep in their bones, that real strength and good health never once came from anything fancy or expensive. It came from a patient pot, honest ingredients, and the simple, quiet wisdom to waste absolutely nothing. Make a big batch of this one on a Sunday, and you'll find it somehow tastes even better by Tuesday, once the beans have had a little more time to soak up every bit of that rich, slow-simmered flavor, which is exactly how a single pot on the back of the stove once managed to carry a whole family clean through an entire working week. There's something quietly powerful sitting in every one of these 10 old soups. Each one took the cheapest, most overlooked ingredients a family could find, and with nothing but time and honest care, turned them into food that built strong, healthy families for generation after generation. That wisdom was never actually lost. It was only ever set aside for a little while, and any one of these 10 pots is sitting there right now, waiting patiently for you to bring it back to your own table. None of these 10 soups needed a supplement aisle, a subscription box, or a single ingredient you couldn't find within walking distance of home, and that's really the whole point worth sitting with. Every one of them was built from a handful of cheap, honest ingredients and a patient stretch of time on the stove, and that combination alone did more for the health of an ordinary family than an entire modern shelf of pills and powders ever manages to do today. Real strength was built quietly, one patient pot at a time, out of bones and beans, and whatever the garden and the pantry happened to provide that week, and it fed generation after generation of people who worked harder with their hands than most of us ever will. If this video stirred something in you today, go ahead and subscribe to this channel right now. Drop a like on your way out, and stick around for the next one, because there's a whole world of old-fashioned food wisdom still waiting for you right here, with a brand new pot to explore together every single week. Until next time, keep that pot simmering.